The core system really represents my attempt to collect, gather, and codify all the information that I've learned from my teachers over the years. It's more than just another style or system. It's really an attempt to envision a whole new paradigm of what a martial art contains, represents, and ultimately could evolve to. Presently, the martial arts are many things to many different people. Obviously, martial implies fighting or combat to some extent. And so for many people, and over the centuries, one of the things that martial arts represented, of course, was an art that could be used in combat. That might mean soldiers in an army using it, or it might mean civilians using it for self-protection. Throughout human history, people have often tried to take what other people had, whether it was their resources, their land, their property, whatever it was, and the means of learning how to combat that, how to defend oneself, all became collected into what collectively is known as martial arts. Now, that has evolved. Of course, we don't have to necessarily use it for self-defense all the time. It's certainly not in martial combats in terms of like an army. But here, throughout the world, and certainly here in the West, many people, of course, approach martial arts as a combative sport. And so you have tournaments, whether it's judo or karate types of tournaments, where people compete either for a monetary purse or for a trophy, or sometimes just for fame. Then we have what's known as the internal martial arts. All the martial arts are really good for health. Just moving, whether it's practicing throws or practicing blocks and strikes and kicks, it works the body. And before we train, we always, loosen all the joints, and we do a lot of stretching. We do warming up exercises. All of that is great body conditioning, which is strictly for health. And then there's what's known as the internal martial arts, things like Tai Chi in the Chinese system, Xing Yi, Bagua. These represent internal systems that use not just brute physical strength, but slow, coordinated movement with breath, and using the mind to activate the movement and the breath in harmony with each other, so that the person develops an internal climate that is conducive to almost moving while in a state of meditation. So while we're doing the physical motion, the mind and the emotions are being settled and connected, often using visualizations to connect the practitioner to the earth herself, known as Mother Earth, something that all of the ancient indigenous medicine men and women have talked about for thousands of years. They talk about connecting to Father Sky or Father Sun, and they see us as human beings as being stretched between heaven and earth. The ancient Chinese, in fact, referred to that as the unification of heaven and earth and mankind. And so all of that has been embodied into what's known as the internal martial arts. Now, as the martial arts developed in China, it developed in two main places. One was in the temples, Buddhist temples and Taoist temples. The most famous temple, which probably many of you have heard about, was known as the Shaolin Temple. This was a Zen Buddhist temple in China. And for 1,000 years, they primarily practiced spiritual cultivation. They spent time meditating for hours a day, sitting in contemplation, doing self-observation, what we might call mindfulness these days. They did various types of rituals, spiritual rituals. And so the purpose was to unify the mind and body with the spirit for achieving higher levels of awareness and consciousness. But over time, it's believed that that type of practice led to many of the monks losing focus, losing attention, even falling asleep at times. And so they began to develop practices that specifically and directly unified mind, body, and breath with awareness. And these types of self-awareness and cultivation exercises became the root of many of the motions that would later evolve into Chinese martial arts, such as Chinese Kung Fu. The other major source of inspiration in China was from Chinese medicine, acupuncture, herbalists. These practitioners would focus on using their medical skills for improving the health of the patients that they worked with. Now, Chinese medicine, unlike the medicine here in the West that has many different specialties, you could be a heart surgeon, or you can be in family medicine or internal medicine, psychiatrist, etc. Chinese medicine was much more holistic. They saw the entire body as a functioning unit: mind, emotions, spirit, energy, qi was the core of what they were attempting to balance and harmonize through all of their medical practices. And so some of those practices, those medical practices, became incorporated into what later became part of Chinese martial arts, because doctors in China were felt to be a model of what they practiced. And so it wasn't enough for them to just put needles in people and give people herbs. They actually had to cultivate themselves and become an exemplar, a sample of what it meant to be a person who had their mind and body integrated in a healthy way. And so they would take the same skills that they had utilized to improve their own health and teach it to their patients. So they might teach them, when a bear stretches its back, it does this. Or when a monkey, reaches for something, it reaches like this. And those same movements of the bear and the monkey or the crane became initially a health practice art, but then over the centuries, some of those same movements became useful as martial arts. So from those two sources, the doctors on the one hand and the priest on the other, Chinese martial arts has been evolving now for hundreds, if not thousands of years in a very unique way. So the core system, as I have formulated it, really is an attempt to restore many of the currently de-emphasized portions of the art back into one space, into one art. I personally have had nearly 25 instructors, teaching over 20 different systems or styles. So what was when I realized that I had actually formulated something that was unique enough to actually deserve its own name, I was at a loss for years and years as to what to call my practice, my art that I had put together. Finally, though, I realized that what I was really doing was rediscovering and re-emphasizing the core practices of all of the systems that I had trained in, you might say really recovering their essence. And so I eventually, after many years, decided to call my system the core system, because I have preserved the core practices of many different arts, which have been practiced over the centuries, of course, in many different ways. And particularly today, where you have people who practice the art just as self-defense, just as a sport, or just as a spiritual practice, or some other aspect, I tried to take all of the aspects for modern day use and combine them into one functional system. Much like a tree, these arts have their roots in fundamental practices. And a tree, as you know, has branches, and then stems, and then leaves, and then fruit. And so depending on what aspect a person chooses to pursue, some of my students might come in and just want a healthy exercise, a good workout. Other students might come in and want peace of mind or spiritual awareness and meditation and cultivation. Some might come in and want to use it to enter some type of sporting contest. Some really see the art as a means of almost artistic self-expression and a way to tap into their own creativity, their own sense of awareness, and use the martial arts as a vehicle for assisting them in meeting those artistic and creative goals in their life. So finding all of those different avenues and needs and integrating them into one system is essentially what the core system is attempting to do. The art can be practiced in a small way where one could just practice for a few minutes, one particular aspect, if that was all a person wanted, or it could be all-consuming and become an entire path of self-expression and self-development and self-cultivation, very similar to how I believe the art was practiced in ancient China in the monasteries, the Taoist and Buddhist temples, where people might be in one of these temples for 10 years, 15, 20, even 30 years or longer, and they essentially could turn their art into a lifestyle, into a way of becoming, the best human being that they could be, the most creative and artistic person they could be, because if you look at those priests, many of them were very skillful artists, poets, calligraphers, musicians, and they used the art to expand themselves in all of those areas so they could reach their peak performance and self-expression. So the martial arts for a student, as taught here at the Taoist Institute, can essentially represent whatever you might want it to be. A lot of that is up to you. All of that and more is actually here and available, but the interest and needs of the student will dictate and guide what they are particularly interested in and decide to pursue. But just know that like a field, if you think of a field out in nature, the field has some basic elements. It has land, dirt, air, water, but within that field, many, many different forms of life will grow, right? You'll have roots and berries and trees and animals and insects, an incredible abundance of life. And the core system really represents a way to tap into all of that abundance and then allow you, the new student, to cultivate that portion that calls to you. I think that every person on this earth, if they get in touch with their deep inner self, will find that they actually have a calling. For some people it's art or music or technology. It might be many, many different aspects. And we believe that by honing these ancient fundamental skills, whatever that calling to one's inner nature represents, our art can support that and provide a context and training tools for a person to express themselves in any way that it seems to be most appropriate for them. That is the mission of the core system.